Welcome. My name is Jay Saper, and I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace in New York City. And I am so fortunate and honored this afternoon to engage in a conversation with one of our movement elders, Dorothy Zellner. So Dorothy Zellner grew up in a political family in New York and traveled south to participate firsthand in the Black freedom movement. In the civil rights movement, she was involved in some of the most radical organizations of the day in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. After that, for years, she's been an activist in some of the most important causes over the years and has found a home also within Jewish Voice for Peace, speaking out for justice for Palestinians. So, Dorothy, it's such a great honor to get to speak with you today. So thank you for joining us. Before we turn to hearing about your stories of your time, especially in the civil rights movement, I would love to hear a little bit about the stories that influence you to become politically active, the things that you heard when you were a child, the things that you were reading about, that your parents were sharing, that were vibrant in your immigrant, leftist, Jewish community. Specifically, could you talk to us about how anti-fascist struggles became a source of inspiration for you?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I have to tell you that this morning I got a shot in my eye because I have macular degeneration, one of the great things that happens to you when you get old. And so you're going to see me wiping my eye now and then, and I might even be blowing my nose. I am not sick. I do not have the virus. I have no sickness. I just have age, age-related macular degeneration. So the first thing I just wanted to say is that. The second thing is that as the years go on, I have found that I get very emotional. At times, you'll just have to put up with it. If you see me weeping, just ignore it. The third thing is to say that I am decidedly not a leader, not. And Jay is wonderful, but I have to correct that. I am a lifelong activist participant. I am like you all. And it's been, starting already. A great, a wonderful thing in my life that I have actually been around leaders and saw what leadership can mean and what leadership actually does. So on the first question, I am a World War II baby, and I was 7 when the war ended in 1945. So we lived at the time in Manhattan. My father was what I call a community dentist. He had his office in the front of the apartment, and we, my brother, sister, and mother and I, lived in the back. The 5 of us lived in 3 rooms in the back. And this was a mom and pop operation, just like a laundry or other things that immigrants would do. And my father would, in between having patients, he would run to the back where we lived and turn on the radio full blast to get the war news. So I grew up with the war news. I was 3 when the war started, and that I was every day, or all day, whenever he could, he was listening to the news. He was especially listening for where the Red Army was, because the Red Army was going to save us, he thought. And actually, he was right. And now historians realize that it had not been for the Red Army, the entire story might have been different. And the war was not just out there. I mean, I saw my mother putting these black curtains over the windows because they were afraid that somehow or other the German planes could possibly get to New York, and they were having air raid drills in the home because you couldn't show light out on the street. And I have to say, by the way, that one of the disadvantages of Zoom is that if any of you don't know what I'm talking about, there's no way you can indicate that. So I hope that you will put something on a chat if I'm saying something that you don't understand. And I remember going to newsreels and seeing children with their legs blown off. I mean, it was traumatic. And I was thinking about the epidemic and the trauma that we're going through. That was a trauma. That was a several years long trauma with, even as a young child, that the war was hanging over us somewhere. And of course, the fact that we were Jewish meant that we were in danger. And when the war was over, my parents had gotten something called the Black Book, which was a very large coffee table book with truly, truly gruesome photos of the liberation of the concentration camps. And I remember, as the oldest child, I was protective of my younger siblings, and I took the book and I threw it in the garbage because I didn't want them to see it. And of course, my parents were livid. How could you throw away a book? That was anathema to them. You can't throw away a book. So later on, as a teenager, I read a book about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And it's, I don't know if any of you have read it, the younger people, you might not. It's called The Wall, and it's by John Hersey. How he did this research, I have no idea, but the book was published in 1950. And as far as I can tell, everything that I've read subsequently shows that his research was correct. Well, I was a teenager, and I sort of transmogrified myself into one of these fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. I would say this book had a tremendous influence on my life. And I would imagine, well, if there were only 50,000 of us left, would I fight? Would I have started to fight? And I had these images of, you know, here the Nazis are walking up 2nd Avenue. Am I going to be on the rooftop? Anyway, it was a very romantic teenage fantasy, but it stayed with me for a long time. And I think, I do remember asking as a child, asking my father, I said, how did they know who to kill? I couldn't understand it. And that turned out to be a big question. How do you know who to kill if you're trying to kill a religious minority or a national, cultural minority? And the only way they knew was to get people to register. So all of that was verified when I went to Yad Vashem, and saw, my father explained to me that the Germans issued passports for Jews, and they had to have a different middle name. The men, whatever your first name was, and then it was Israel, and then it was your last name. And the women, whatever your first name, then your middle name was Sarah, and then your last name. And my mother's name happened to be Sarah. And this was part of the registration process, to isolate people and make them distinct so that you could round them up later on. So of course, that has stayed with me for a lifetime, is how a numerical minority can be protected. So these were all traumatic events as a child and stayed with me for a very long time. So that's my answer to that one. Probably took too long, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you. It was just right. Really, really appreciate it. So then you got news, you were reading a newspaper, you heard of the sit-in in Greensboro, and you knew that you wanted to head south to participate in the sit-in movement. You go to Miami, participate in a sit-in there, then help to organize them in New Orleans and spend time in a few different organizations. But in addition to participating directly in the sit-ins, you helped to write what became a really landmark study at the time of the movement, looking at who was participating in them, why, and really showing how widespread this collective direct action was and why it was being so effective. So could you walk us through both what it felt like preparing for and carrying out a sit-in, as well as what you learned about the power of ordinary people taking collective action on such a wide scale.
Yes, very good, Jay, very good. Well, I went south first, and I got involved with the Congress of Racial Equality, and that is the organization as it existed then, not this weird version of what it is now. And we had a sit-in in a restaurant, and we all got arrested. Everybody says, oh, Miami, what are you talking about? Well, Miami was actually totally segregated, a typical segregated city. And we were arrested, duly arrested, and on the way to the jail, I realized I was the only white woman in the group. So that was scary. That was really scary. Nothing happened to me. I was only in overnight. Then when I went to New Orleans, it was to assist the young Black people who were going to organize their first sit-in. And this was very instructive to me in a lot of ways. I was the ally. We didn't use that word then. And they asked me to do what an ally can do. And in this case was to try to get support in the white community for the upcoming sit-in, the first sit-in. I can't convey to you exactly how scary these sit-ins were that were just starting. Everybody who went in to sit in knew that they were going to be arrested. The crowds of these white people were truly terrifying, and the police did their best to accommodate the crowds. So there would be a crowd of people screaming at these people who are sitting in. The sit-in people are doing nothing illegal. It's the crowds that is doing the illegal thing, and the police are doing nothing. So they asked me to case the Woolworths. The Woolworths was the big focus of sit-ins in those days. And so before it started, I walked around and I, figured out where everything was, and I told them. And while the sit-in was going on, I had to go to the bathroom. And of course I had to go into the white bathroom because naturally everything was segregated. And I remember sitting on a stall, and there were women in this bathroom who were talking the worst racist garbage I ever heard in my life. I mean, I was 22. I never even heard anything like that for the rest of my life. And what they were going to do to these people, and using N-words, everything else, it turned out that these were the women who are memorialized in some of the photos that were taken when those little children went into the public schools 2 weeks later in New Orleans. And these were the women who were screaming at them, and little Ruby Bridges going in with the US Marshals famous, Rockwell painting. And these women were standing in that waiting room, in the bathroom with me. These were the same women that's haunted me all my life. Then I went home, and I was determined to go back south. Now, Jay, I think I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but what I heard when I got home was that SNCC was the organization to go to. So I wrote letters to SNCC. Of course, they got letters and they threw them in the garbage, I'm sure. I mean, there was nobody to even answer them. SNCC then was this network of campus groups. And finally, by all kinds of accidents, which I won't bore you with, I ended up working at the Southern Regional Council, which was then a sort of goody two-shoes, interracial organization, decidedly middle of the road, very hostile to the freedom rides, by the way. And my assignment was to look through every single newspaper clipping that they could get their hands on at any newspaper and make a research report, which they were going to issue about what had actually happened in the first year and a half after the sit-in started. So this is the actual document, 61, from 1961, 59 years old. And some of the figures, and is now used, by the way, my name is not on here. Naturally, this was Invisible Women's work. I did the research, I wrote it, it was edited by the big boss, and my name was nowhere and never has been anywhere. So this is the research that I did. In the first year and a half, every border state and southern state was affected by protest demonstrations. So 13 states plus. Over 100 cities in the South, I'm reading, and in the border states have had sit-ins or other forms of direct action. An estimated 3,600 students and supporters been arrested. At least 70,000 Negroes and whites, Negroes, of course, the term of art in those days, in these states have actively participated in some way. This figure counts persons who sat in, picketed, marched, and attended mass meetings, sometimes in the face of intimidation. It does not account for thousands of others who supported the movement by letters to the editor, financial contributions, or in expressions of moral support. This survey ended up on the front page of the New York Times and is now, if you Google, this will come up. This is the research standard. So I'm very pleased to be able to do that, but of course, as you see, it reflects all kinds of other issues, you know, invisible work and so forth. Let's see. I was lucky enough. I was sitting in an office in Atlanta. The SNCC office was a 20-minute walk away. And I was reading about these people. Who were these people? Who could these people be who would travel from town to town, my age, younger, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, who said to people, well, we're here. We're gonna work with you and organize. We know you want to register to vote, and we're gonna help you organize and take leadership from you. Who were these unbelievable people? And I was looking at their names. And the office, the SNCC office, was 20 minutes away. I was so in awe of them that it took me 5 months to get up the courage to walk 20 minutes. That's what I mean about I'm not being a leader. When I got there, the first person I met was Jim Foreman, the great Jim Foreman, who was the executive director of SNCC, executive secretary, pardon me. And he said to me, I'm Jim. I said, they called me Dottie then, I'm Dorothy Zellner. And he said to me, can you type? Okay. So I said, yes. Well, this interchange then was used later on in the women's movement as a classic example of sexism, except it wasn't. He was asking me, could I do something that they needed to be done? Fortunately for me, I could type. How else were they going to use me? Here is a white woman from New York, a Jewish woman. Am I going to be going into the countryside in Mississippi and organize anybody? Please give me a break. So he gave me the chance to contribute by asking, did I have a skill that was usable? Not long after that, I said to him, Jim, I said, I can also write. And he said, oh, great. And he put me to work working with Julian Bond. And we worked on the student voice, and we did all the press work. We did the press releases, worked with the press. So for more than 50 years, I've had to explain this remark, which was actually not only not sexism, it was an example of how he did feel about women, that he wanted women to participate with the skills that they had. And that's how, so I worked during the day for the Southern Regional Council, and at night I went and I volunteered at SNCC. And this is what I did. I sat down at a typewriter. I was a very fast typist, but very inaccurate. So rather than stop and correct anything, I just X'd out where I made a mistake. So to this day, if I see old documents that SNCC has, I can tell if I typed them by how many errors are on the page. And I would sit there at the typewriter, and a field secretary, which is what we called all of these young people, mostly men, but women too, who would come in from the field. The field was everything but the Atlanta office, and they would give reports about what they had done. And we would call them depositions, and we would send them to the federal government. I'll explain that. So I would sit there typing like this, and the story was always the same. We took a group of 5 or 6, 10 or 20 people to the county courthouse. They stood out in the boiling sun for 10 hours. Then they were allowed in, and then they were asked that these are people who wanted to register to vote. And then they were asked to interpret, this is in the state of Mississippi, to interpret the state constitution. Now, the state constitution had been amended constantly, and especially after the Civil War, with Black codes and other laws that counteracted the Black codes. And it was this big, and it was written in 19th century language, and they would open up the book and say, read that, pointing at a random page. Well, naturally, a lot of people couldn't read, so that's when they failed instantly. However, in places like Jackson, there were Black PhDs and professors who definitely could read. They would read it, and then the registrar would say, interpret what you read. Well, interpret, that's a good. So whatever this person who was literate said, wrong, it's wrong. You can't read. You can't register. And yet a white person who could come in, who was barely literate, who could sign their name, they could register to vote. So I have another little thing to read you. And I get as worked up now as I was then. I'm 82 years old. I'm sitting here ready to kill a registrar. Okay, so I'm reading to you now from a book that was published every year by the US Civil Rights Commission, which was an actual commission, and it actually did some good, unbelievably. And this was a record of the registration in every county in the state of Mississippi. So I'm going to only read to you the result of 2. One, it was Sharkey County, a horrible, miserable little county. The non-white population, 69%. Number of registered voters, 3. Okay, 3. Tunica County, which I believe is now where there is some big casino. I think that's the home of Tupelo, I'm not sure. In this case, 79% of the county, non-white, as they called it then, 22 registered. And I have the list. This is from 1962. In some cases, the number of registrants, 3, 0, 6, 2, 4. This is in the United States of America in 1961. That's who could register. Meanwhile, the United States was broadcasting all over the world that it was the home of the land of the free and the great democracy. And we were down there. By the time I got involved, there were 2 people who had been killed already for trying to register to vote. And here were these colossal young people, and I'm reading their names in the paper, one of whom happened to be my ex-husband's name. And his name is Zellner. My family name is Miller. And I said to myself, who is this Jewish boy running around with these people? Except that he wasn't a Jewish boy. His father was a minister. And I ultimately met him, and he became my husband. So what I find in talking to people now, especially young people, is first I have to set the context. Unfortunately, if you're young, if you're under the age of 40, the chances of you ever having a textbook, or I say 50, having a textbook that had more than 3 pages about the civil rights movement is virtually nil. The textbooks barely mention it, and in the popular imagination, it is all boiled down to one sentence. Dr. King had a dream and Mrs. Parks sat down. And that's the civil rights movement. This is why I'm so interested in talking to young people, is to give them the context. Everybody thinks of segregation, oh, Mrs. Parks had to ride in the back of the bus. Well, that's true, that's true. But the depth of segregation and the horror of segregation is very seldom communicated. And the fact is that your entire life was patterned according to your race, according to your color, from the time you got up in the morning till the time you got to bed. And a lot of people don't realize that in addition to the public transportation, the libraries were segregated. Of course, the restaurants were segregated. The movie theaters were segregated. The doctor's offices were segregated. The dentist's office was segregated. The hospitals were segregated. As we know, Bessie Smith bled to death on a side of a road in Mississippi because they couldn't get her to the nearest hospital in time, which was the White Hospital. And the example that I give when I'm talking to young people is, if you lived in Atlanta in 1961, when I got there, when everything was rigidly segregated, if you were a member of the Black middle class, which was definitely a possibility since there were 5 Black colleges in Atlanta then and are now, and let's say you were a woman and you went and you had a really fancy thing to go to and you bought a $400 dress. Well, you're looking at somebody who has never bought a $400 dress in her entire life. But if I had to make an investment like that, they would buy a $400 dress and they couldn't try it on. There were no try-on facilities for Black women. The subtext of this is, okay, see, this is where I get worked up again. The subtext of this is, your body has contaminated this dress. Okay? You can't try it on. You take it home. If you don't like it, or it doesn't look good on you, or it doesn't fit, too bad. I would actually start cursing now if I wasn't intimidated by being on Zoom with 105 people. So, and that was the subtext. Your body had contaminated this dress. Well, it's hard for a white person to imagine what that is like all day. If you are in a persecuted minority of white people, I think your imagination can extend farther, which is what, in my case, being a Jew did for me, that it extended me farther so that I could appreciate what other people were going through. That's why I'm such a maniac about history. First of all, I and other civil rights vets who may or may not be on this phone, like other veterans of other movements, we are not going to last forever. And what we went through and what we saw, I need to give you. I'm giving you guys a gift. I mean, I would talk to 105 of you. I would talk to 10,000 of you. What I went through when you listened to me and what I saw, I mean, not what I went through, I didn't go through that much, but what I saw is now yours. And what I tell really young people is they can take your iPhone away, they can take your iPad away, your computer away, but they never can take what's in here away. So I am giving you this history, now it's yours. You didn't experience, but you heard me say it, and you can visualize what I'm saying. It's now yours. Nobody can take it away. This is what, and this is what Howard Zinn, who was a favorite of mine, also talked about. He said, we tend to look at our history in terms of the horrible things that happened, but we don't look often enough at the successes that we had, the great successes that we had. And if we did, it would give us courage to go up against these incredible odds, but we have overcome those odds at different times. And I'm looking around at all kinds of things to give me inspiration and me courage. Like I saw just this week something on one of our PBS stations about the abolitionists. And I looked and I said, well, we don't have to look too far in our history. We have some unbelievable examples. And John Brown, I recommend everybody start reading about John Brown. I mean, we have John Browns, we have Mrs. Hamers, we have them right now. And they might be on the next street from everybody. And we don't know. That's the great thing that SNCC did. SNCC found Mrs. Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was there all the time. They found her. And they found plenty of other Mrs. Hamers also. Okay, so I have gone very far afield, I see.
Thank you.
Wait, just let me add one thing. I think most of the vets would agree with me. If anything else SNCC did, it was show that ordinary people have tremendous power, have power and courage that they don't even realize they have, that has never been called on and never tapped into. Any one of us who have been through the civil rights movement knows what it means to be in a tremendous social movement where from one day to next, people who doubted that they could ever do anything are suddenly doing something, and they're doing something that has an impact. We know better than anybody else. We look, I mean, all of us, when we talk, we're looking at a sea of faces. I mean, I just was talking in Brooklyn just 3 or 4 months ago, and I said, there were 50 people in the audience. I said, you don't realize what the power, that your power, you could change Brooklyn. You could change, just 50 of you doing certain kind of key work could change everything. So, and it's not that this is mystical. This is not a religious experience. This is because of what we saw. We saw actual people doing this. Now, I have a letter from Mrs. Hamer in my house, a framed letter, because I said to her one day when I had met her, I said, Mrs. Hamer, I think you should run for office. And then later on I said, was I the first person who asked her that? And I wrote to her and I said, Mrs. Hamer, am I the first person? And she wrote back and she said, yes, you are. And she actually did run for office with the Freedom Democratic Party. If she even got past the 4th grade, I would be surprised. And she is a model of that kind of behavior that I'm talking about. Brave as a lion, smart, no education, a really splendid human being. And it was like a point of pride to me that I thought, and I'm sure other people thought, here is a person who everybody would say is an ordinary person. This person is capable of great things. Okay, I think I better stop now. So Jay, onward.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. Really appreciate it. So you talk a lot about your work and that of so many you were honored to meet in lifting up Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and acknowledging all of the women who were so active in the movement, whose names and whose stories haven't always been recorded. And you also then dedicated your life to trying to collect the stories of women in SNCC, and along with some of the other folks who are joining us on our call, published a really outstanding book that really everybody should have if you want to understand anything about the civil rights movement. It's called Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts by women in SNCC. So thankfully to you, you're sharing us, yes, the gift of your personal story now, but have also really shared with the world the gift of this collection of the voice of so many of the activists in SNCC, of these women, their brave tales. So a really incredible book. But I wondered if you could also tell us about a woman who is very influential in SNCC existing in the first place, and SNCC in maintaining its independence from the other civil rights organizations that wanted to clamp down and not allow it to take the radical stances that it did. And this wasn't a young person, it wasn't a student herself, it was Miss Ella Baker. Could you tell us about your relationship with her, who she was, why, how she shaped the movement, and why her dedication to preserving the independence of SNCC to be a radical organization was so significant?
Yes, Mrs. Ella Baker, Miss Baker, as I always called her, as a sign of respect, I have to just say in parentheses here that another vicious aspect of segregation was that Black people were deprived of their honorific, which now we would tend to say, oh, who cares, but it was meaningful. When I first went to Atlanta, I lived on the white side of town, and I had a phone set up, and the phone company called me and said, Miss Miller, we're coming out and putting in your phone. 6 months later, I moved to the Black side, and I was living with Jenin Bond, Julian Bond's sister. And I called the phone company, and I said, I need to put in a phone. And they said, okay, Dorothy, when we'll come out. So to me, Miss Baker was then 30 years older than I was. And so she was always Miss Baker to me. She was an amazing woman. There's a movie about her that people should try to see. Not easy to see these days. It was done, I think, in 1988. It's called Fundi, which is a word from an African language of the person who tells the stories, the person who is the continuation of the struggle, and the teacher. That's what Fundi means. And she got involved in the 30s in Harlem in the Black Renaissance. And then in the 40s, unbelievable to this day, she traveled alone for the NAACP all over the South alone. I stress that because this was a time when people were still being lynched in great numbers. And she was the head of branches. She was the main contact between branches and the central organization. And by the time the sit-in movement started, she had already been working at SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, with Dr. King and other ministers, not having an easy time of it, according to this movie, where someone asked her, how was it working with a bunch of men? And she said, not easy, that they didn't really appreciate it when she said no. When she said no, that things were not, then when she had criticisms about ideas and about programs. So along comes the sit-in movement, okay? Well, this was colossal. Nobody expected this. This is another lesson that I try to tell young people. You never know, you have no idea. 2 weeks before the sit-in movement, nobody could have predicted this would happen. And when it did happen, nobody could predict that it would take off the way it took off. I mean, within days, there were sit-ins going on all over the South in Black colleges. She knew. She was highly political. She had met tons of people in Harlem. She was very familiar with the middle sort of political and the left. She knew this was colossal. She knew. That's another great gift of leaders that I've found, that they know when there is the moment that they should be moving. And she knew that at that time, these kids were not so radical. What they were doing was actually saying, we are going to break the back of public accommodations. That wasn't, as radical as later on as other things turned out to be. But she knew, and right away, SCLC and the NAACP, they all looked at this group of colossal young people and said, we want them. And we want them as our youth division, And she held them off. I don't know how she did it. She just said, no, no, no. And they've got to stand on their own. Now, this was unbelievable in those days. Actually, it might even be unbelievable now. There was no money. Forget money. Forget fundraising. There were people who were just willing to stand up and go to jail. And she won. And she helped SNCC form its first organizing conference, which was April 1960. And by the way, we were supposed to have our 60th anniversary this April, and had it not been for the virus, we would have had it. And she was its, well, I could say its mother. She was another tribute of this leadership that I'm talking about is that she sat in the back of the room listening. That's what she did most of the time. And at the time, we all smoked like chimneys, and she sat in the back wearing a mask. Now we know her. Now I know what she must have gone through wearing that damn mask. And she sat in the back, and the clouds of smoke billowing around her. And she listened and listened. And then people would say, well, Miss Baker, what do you think? And then she would say some incredibly profound thing in this very deep voice that she had. She was an amazing, amazing woman. And she was one of the 3 advisors that SNCC had. SNCC had Howard Zinn was an advisor. I don't know if people know that about SNCC, that he was one of the adult advisors. There was another one, a Connie Curry, a white woman who had worked with the Y. And then there was Miss Baker. But Miss Baker was the one who everybody relied on the most. Now, some schools are named after her. When she died, nobody had ever heard of her. She died in 1988. Forget it. Now there's some, recognition. Without her, SNCC probably would not have gotten off the ground. And then the whole story would have been different, friends, because what SNCC managed to do in 5 years was what people were unable to do the previous 80 years. And SNCC has not gotten its due either. And to this very day, I will watch something, we will watch something, and we know that SNCC was instrumental in that event, and it's seldom mentioned. And I have to say, there never was a group of people like this. I hope that someday in your life, and maybe you have such a group now that you're relating to, we're talking about courage, we're talking about imagination, we're talking about fall on the floor humor, we're talking about music, we're talking about these incredible gifts. It's amazing to me. Sometimes I'm just staggered thinking about where did they come from? And I, at the time, let's see, when I first went down, I was 22. In the summer of 64, when we went to Mississippi, I was one of the elderly people. I was 26. And there were 18 and 19-year-olds who went into the most horribly dangerous, scary places and organized people. That's also sustained me, because I know what these young people can do. That's why I know what JVP can do, because I know what's lying out there and what the gifts are that people can bring to this movement. So, okay. Okay, go on, Jay. Or now I think we're up to the summer of '64.
Thank
Should I
you.
just
Yes,
that?
thank you for sharing all of that.
Are people
Uh,
getting bored? I don't know if they're getting bored.
People are amazed. The chat is just overwhelmingly flowing with love. People are sharing
Oh,
resources to learn more about Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer
oh,
and Miss
oh,
Ella Baker.
all right.
People are really enthralled by your story. So thank you for all that you were sharing. People are expressing a great deal of appreciation and love.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so
So
long.
then you come back north and you're working at an office in Cambridge,
Yes,
Massachusetts,
I'm running this.
and you start to take in applications for people who want to volunteer for the summer project. This is in 1964 for what became the storied Mississippi Freedom Summer. You
Yes,
yourself were even experiencing fears of going back down south, going to Mississippi, but you realized that if you were bringing people in to do so, you should follow through yourself on that commitment. You were with Julian Bond in Oxford, Ohio, doing the training for the volunteers who were to go down when you all received news that James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner had gone missing. Later, we'd learn that the police had arrested them after investigating the burning of a church where Freedom School was to open. And then the police had deliberately let them out to the Klan to be brutally murdered.
right.
Despite this occurring, nearly everybody at the training in Oxford, Ohio, still went south, still went down to Mississippi. In the face of such great fear, how did you muster the courage to carry on? In addition to the white supremacist terrorist violence that the movement faced and that Black people faced, how did you continue to persist in the face of this terrorist violence, as well as the surveillance of the FBI, which also very specifically led to you being removed from a position of employment as well? How did you carry on organizing in the face of fear?
Okay, so I'm making little notes for myself here. Well, first of all, when the summer of '64 was proposed, a lot of SNCC people, myself included, were actually against it. And some of us have talked about it. And the fears were that if a large number of white people come, how will that, what changes will occur in that wake? And I know that JVP has done some really pioneer work in its ranks, dealing with racism and dealing with discrimination against parts of the Jewish community, the Mizrahi and the Sephardim. And so there were fears, you know, oh, the white people will come, they'll get all the attention, the press will be looking at them. What about the Black people who've suffered here for generations and so forth? Very real question. And as I remember, Bob Moses was totally realistic and practical about this. He said, yes, we are going to use this. Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. When white people come down, then the press will come down. Then the attention will come down. That's exactly what we want. And he was insistent that there be this project. And he won over the staff. That's a very interesting chapter, you know, that people haven't really examined very well. Anyway, here I was running the SNCC office in Boston. I was petrified out of my mind. I was having dreams and walking fantasies, waking fantasies that I would be lucky enough to be run over by a car and break my leg, and then I couldn't go, you know, because how could I go down in crutches? But unfortunately, nobody ran me over. I knew, of course, I had to go. My main function was working with my wonderful colleague, Kate Clark, who was the daughter of Kenneth Clark, the famous Black psychologist whose work with young children and dolls was used in the Roe versus Wade famous Supreme Court case. So she and I were a team, and we interviewed people, and we were ruthless. We said no to many people, and anybody who looked like a diva, divas, we that's it. You weren't getting past us, or crazy or divas. You weren't getting past us. And actually, there's some footage in this movie, A Freedom Summer, which Stanley Nelson did of me, which I didn't even remember. And I'm asking some very obvious questions of this applicant who desperately wants to go south. And of course, he's figuring out how he should answer. Like, one of the questions that we asked was, will you feel comfortable going to church? And will you feel comfortable wearing a white shirt to go to church and not go to church in shorts and sandals? I mean, we really got down and dirty with them. And some people we said no, because we didn't trust them. And guess what? We were right. In the future, I don't know if other people did as much of his questioning as we did, but we did hear complaints later on about a very few white people who got down and, they weren't satisfied with their accommodations, and they felt, constrained. We wanted people to know, you are going to be constrained. You are going to have to show respect. And we took it for granted, and we said, and you may die. And there's actual footage of me saying, and do you realize that you may die? Now, I was 26. Did I realize I was going to die? No, 26-year-olds don't realize that they're going to die. And this kid, who was probably 19, some Harvard kid, he didn't realize he was going to die either. So he said he was ready. He was ready. So one of these 19-year-olds, who is still my friend to this day, ended up traveling all over the state of Mississippi, fixing up these two-way radios. This is what I mean about creativity and ingenuity. We hardly had 3 dimes to rub together. He set up these two-way radios so that when we were in Mississippi, we could talk to people who were driving on these horrible, scary roads with, mobs waiting to kill them. Anyway, so I'm afraid that to this day, people remember this interview, because we had a reunion a few years ago and people came up to me and said, the interview that I had to go through to get to Mississippi was the worst interview of my life. And I don't know whether to feel happy about that or not happy about that. But it meant so much to us that the right people would go down. And we knew that if the wrong people went down, it could be calamitous. So that was my big participation in that. Now, it's about fear, okay? I told you, I'm not a leader, and I would put myself down as a garden variety coward. I mean, I'm not gonna take big risks with my life. However, if you're in a movement, you are going to end up in situations that you didn't create that are dangerous situations. So how do you get through that? Well, I found that the way that I got through it was the bond that I had with the people that I was working with was so strong. It didn't counter the fear, but it forbade me to leave. Now, in a multiracial situation, I easily could have left. I could have just walked up and walked, in some cases, across the street and disappeared into whiteness. But how could I do that? These were people that I loved and respected. So even though I was horribly afraid, I somehow managed to stay on my feet. I don't think that I necessarily showed that I was afraid. I don't know, other people might have felt the same way. So that's my experience with fear, is that there are other things that are stronger than fear, and your bond with your fellow organizers can really drown out the fear. Now, I don't know how we're doing on time, but if you want to get back to it, I actually was in scary situations. I don't know if Judy Richardson is on this phone, but she and I were actually shot at in Mississippi, and probably the scariest thing that ever happened to me was in Danville, Virginia, which is a whole other story. So I have been in scary situations, no question about it. Then and then afterwards. The fear will kill you if you're alone. It will kill you. But if you're not alone, you can do things that you never thought you were capable of doing. Now, I just want to use this question to tell you a couple of other things. In Oxford, Ohio, when these three guys went missing, and they went missing the day that they arrived, the next day that they arrived in Mississippi, Julian and I had done a workshop for communications people. Every project in that summer had a communications person. And we taught them that if one of their duties was keeping track of where everybody was. And we said, if somebody is supposed to be somewhere at 3:30 and it's 3:40, start calling. Now, this was probably the greatest cultural problem that I had going south, because 3:40 could mean 3:43 days later, and here I was in New York, and I was, 9 o'clock was 9 o'clock, and it was a whole different thing in the South. Well, but they listened, and apparently when these three guys went missing and were supposed to be back, I think at 3 o'clock, and it wasn't 3 o'clock, they started calling. And that's how this case was cracked. We would never know, if to this day, what happened to them if they hadn't called the jail. And it so happened that the sheriff's wife answered the phone, because the sheriff was off somewhere. I don't know what nefarious things he was doing. And she said, yes, these people were picked up, but they've been released. That was how we knew that they were missing. Now, I say missing, that is probably my whiteness talking, because I thought they were missing, but every Black person knew they were dead. And I had an experience with Rita Schwerner, who was Mickey Schwerner's wife, which modeled for me for the rest of my life is how a white person should behave. When we realized that they were dead, and all of a sudden the press came, oh my God, the TV cameras and everything. Here, weeks before, we had been begging them for coverage. Now, of course, when somebody dies, then they're all over the place. And they kept saying to her, Mrs. Schwerner, how do you feel? So that question has driven me crazy from that day to this. Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, your child died in a fire. How do you feel? How are you going to feel? Don't ask me a question like that. Well, it was Mrs. Schwerner, how do you feel? And Mrs. Schwerner, knowing very well the racial politics, said, if my husband were Black, you would not even be asking me this question. And they were shocked. I watched them. I was standing like, I don't know, 8 or 9 feet away. They were shocked, like, oh, she's not playing the game. She refused to play the game. She spoke as a white person who was an ally. She would not play the game. She kept bringing up race. And they were flummoxed totally. They didn't know what to do. They finally moved away from her. I have told her this many times, this story. I mean, I've told her what it meant to me to watch. Here she was in extremis. Her husband had probably been killed the day before, and she had the presence of mind to say, you would not even be talking to me if my husband were Black. So that stayed with me always. That if you have the privilege, use the privilege. Because they did not rush up to Mrs. Cheney, James's mother. They, of course, went to the 2 white boys, naturally, their parents. And fortunately for us, the parents were militants themselves, actually on the left. And they knew what to do also to use their privilege. They got on the phone to President Johnson, and there are tapes that have been transcribed where he lived in mortal fear of these parents. Oh my God, it's those parents. I can't speak to them. I don't want to speak to them. And it's because of them and this huge uproar in the Black community that they even went looking, that the FBI even arrived and went looking. And the case was only cracked because they had a reward, and some greedy person wanted the money and was a stool pigeon, luckily. There's a whole other history which we won't get into now, but that is the history of red baiting in the civil rights movement, which people have to deal with. SNCC was always under pressure from other organizations inside the civil rights movement that it abandoned anybody who they thought was a communist. There's, that's the other thing that's very hard to convey when you're talking about this period of time, because there's no analog now. There's incredible fear of association with people with dangerous views. And SNCC was under pressure constantly about this and bravely resisted, which also was a change in the direction of the civil rights movement. And I am convinced to this day that they knew, the House Un-American Activities Committee and other agents of government knew that SNCC was not going to cooperate if they were subpoenaed to testify. And that's why they were never subpoenaed. And I'm convinced that people would not have cooperated. I know this for a fact, not have cooperated. So someday there'll be a book about that, I hope. Now, just to say, okay, so Jay, over to you.
Thank you. And so Judy Richardson is indeed here with us. And so we will certainly be turning it over to veterans on the call towards the end. I would love to hear your voice, and an honor you're here listening as well. Appreciate all of your work, your life's work, everything you're sharing in the chat, the resources, your work on the book with Dorothy, all of that. So thank you. Also, Judy's asked me if you would share specifically the Danville story. SNCC really changed the world. You've shared with us already so many of the ways in which it has. Yet for so long, the public knew so little about the significance of the organization. But you specifically were assigned, you've talked about working closely with Julian Bond. The two of you collaborated a lot on the publishing efforts during the movement. So what did you learn, both helping to put out the student voice, as well as the pamphlet about your experience accompanied by Danny Lyon's photographs? Why is it important for movements to document and to tell our own stories?
Well, this goes to the center, I think, of Howard Zinn's work and other historians, great historians. The history doesn't exist unless you know about it. And of course, we know that the people who write the history and the people who publish the history have a disproportionate power. I'm a complete maniac about this because people need to know what we did, because what we did can be done again. And it's really very rudimentary to me. Now, Jim Foreman, as I told you before, the executive director, late lamented Jim Foreman, he was a bug about this. And he always said to us constantly, he said, write it down, write it down. In the early days, when I was sitting there typing, I was typing up something that we called depositions. They weren't exactly depositions. I mean, they weren't, they weren't sworn documents. But he sent them by the bushel load to Washington. And where they are is somewhere in the records of the Justice Department. And of course, under this person here, who knows, they probably threw them out in the garbage. But These were depositions. This is what is happening down here, that Mr. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so are trying to register to vote, and this is what happened. That's what I was typing, was statements about what was actually happening. Of course, you have to know that it's happening, but you also have to internalize what this history means. That's what I think the great chroniclers, like Judy, by the way, and she won't say this about herself, but she was key in Eyes on the Prize, documenting that great series that I hope all of you have seen. And she is the one who said, we have to interview Mrs. So-and-so. Nobody ever heard of Mrs. So-and-so, and this is what she did. And this is what we have, why we have to interview this person who nobody ever heard of. None of us have ever heard of each other. You know, we're atomized. Who do we hear of? We hear of that cretin in the White House. That's what we hear about. So Judy and I and 4 other women did this book. And here, I'll pick it up again. Hands on the Freedom Plow. It's published in 2010. And actually, it's still selling copies. In my opinion, it's one of the great books about the civil rights movement by 52 women, most of whom who never heard of me, never heard of Judy, never heard of any of the women who, you know, who experienced this, and they wrote and said their own story. Now, Judy wants me to talk about Danville. Danville was a typical example of how SNCC worked. Somebody would call up and say, this is Reverend so-and-so or Mr. or Mrs. so-and-so in X place, and we have a movement here and we're in trouble, we need help. Meaning we need expertise on organizing, but we also need press and we need things like that. Foreman was a maniac about history, as I've said. So he said to me, I want you to go up there and write a pamphlet about this. Foreman was nothing if not imaginative. I mean, you didn't only write a newsletter, you wrote a pamphlet. You didn't only hire a creative guy like Danny Lyon, who was a photographer, now one of the best known photographers in the United States, 20-year-old kid. You said, go here, take photographs of these girls in the stockade in Southwest Georgia. Go there. Danny did a book. Oh, it's too bad well, I don't know if you want me to run and get the book, but I mean, Danny did photos, age 20, of us and other people that, you know, that will live forever, those photographs. So he said to me, go, and Danny will go and he'll take photographs. Okay, so we went to Danville, was this mean little mill town in Virginia. Mean place. And the local movement was in deep doo-doo. I mean, a lot of people have been arrested. And when I got there, I participated in a demonstration where everybody knelt in prayer by the local Black minister. And I was then they turned the fire hoses on us. Okay. I mean, I have to stop here. We're demonstrating. It's perfectly legal under US law, and they turned the fire hoses on us. So of course I was knocked to the ground and my shoes disappeared, my purse, so I don't know what happened to my purse. And I was getting on my hands and knees to get up, and this cop comes over and hits me right on the head with his club. And as I said later, you know, I always thought that was an expression, you know, that you saw stars. I actually did see stars. And I think what I saw was little burst blood vessels in my brain is what I was actually seeing. And a lot of people, there were a lot of casualties, you know, much worse than mine. And Danny took pictures of them all. People have gone to the hospital with their bandages and everything. So the next day, this community was definitely not intimidated. They had all kinds of demands about employment and segregation and so forth. So they decided they were going to go and be on the front steps of the city hall, period, I mean, they were going to stay there with no end in sight. By this time, foreman had arrived. And so here we were, about 40 people on the steps of the City Hall. And there's foreman, and we're sitting there. We sat there for 8 hours. And all of a sudden, and foreman kept us alert by conducting Black history lessons on the steps. He would walk back and forth and he'd say, "Who is Harriet Tubman?" And he was trying to keep our minds together. And all of a sudden, the fire trucks arrived right across the street. And I said, uh-oh, this is going to be bad. I was really afraid of the fire hoses. And we had heard all kinds of things, you know, that if they direct the water, high pressure water, you can lose your eyesight. You know, this was scary. People now see the footage of people in Montgomery and the fire hoses being turned on them, and they look sort of graceful, you know, they're sort of moving like this and that because of the water. It wasn't like that. It was scary. So this mean little town, they had also deputized any white man to be a deputy sheriff. So all of a sudden, all these white people, half of whom I don't know who they were, maybe they were even drunks from the street, were now entitled to brutalize us being 40 people from the community. And so the fire trucks arrived, and then all of these deputies, in quotes, were around. And I said that was the time I was the most scared. I was sitting, holding on to the banister on the steps of this city hall. And I said, this is going to be bad. But like I said before, there was no way that I could get up. I was terrified. And foreman knew we were in for a catastrophe. And all of a sudden, he decided, he went up to the police chief and he said, "Are you really going to go ahead with this? Do you realize what is going to happen?" And he distracted him for a moment. And then he motioned, if I was standing here, you know, you'd see my hand. He motioned in the back that we should all get up. And he saved our lives, I'm sure. I mean, somebody would have been killed because the idea was to turn the water on us. And as we rolled down the steps, these crowd of white men would come and kill somebody and beat them up. So that's really the closest that I ever came. And I think about this, you know, this cop occasionally, now and then. I think about what was in his mind. Just here I was, you know, at the time I weighed 106 pounds. I had no purse. I had obviously no weapon. What was going through his mind? I mean, I have an idea. What was going through his mind was, I'll show this little white, you know what, lover. I'll show her. He was about 6'3". He was huge. So there you go. There you go. Now, I haven't been back to Danville. It turns out Danny and I and several other people were charged with a felony in a absentia. The felony was conspiring to aid in the forceful overthrow of the state of Virginia by the colored population, or words to that effect, which I think were probably one of the black codes. And it was a felony. And so foreman said to us, "You got to leave." He didn't, I don't want to pay the bond. You know, we don't have money for bond. We don't have money for the lawyers. So leave. And we left. We were left. We left via a pink Cadillac, which was in the black community, and we were on the floor in the back seat under newspapers, and that's how we got out. And they drove us to the airport. And we stood there, and Danny registered us as Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. And that, which of course made me hysterical laughing. I was either laughing or crying or both at the same time. So we all have stories like that. I don't know who else is on. Betty Garman Robinson may be also on this call, another veteran who is also another editor on our book. These stories, I'm telling you, they're yours now. They're yours. I'm giving them to you. So I don't know where we are in time. Where are we on time? But I can sort of feel like I'm getting a little tired. Okay, you asked about, I think I have 3 more questions here.
Well, so we would certainly love, a lot of the people that you named are certainly on the call, and we would love to take some words from them as well. We are coming towards the end of our conversation with you, but first I also want, if you would share some words with us about your identity and the fact that you took lessons from Rita Scherner about the importance of forefronting the Black experience and forefronting those who were suffering the most intense violence and whose rights you were standing unconditionally for. Yet you were so motivated to take this solidarity, to engage, and you also even helped to add some of the whiskers to the illustration of the Black Panther that then got used in Lowndes County and then got used by the Black Panther Party and became a symbol of Black power. And you've been so committed to solidarity, yet it wasn't really acknowledged or known, or it was known but not really acknowledged, the disproportionate participation of Jewish women in the civil rights movement until Deborah Schultz wrote her book, which you're featured in, Going South, Jewish Women in the Civil Rights Movement. Could you share with us how you came to understand your organizing as part of a Jewish tradition of struggling for social justice?
Okay, so just briefly, when Deborah was interested in writing this book, I gave her a very hard time about it. And I said, really, what, Jewish women? We didn't go down as Jewish women. We didn't go in a club, we weren't in a club of Jewish women. We didn't relate, some of these women I didn't even know. And she somehow persuaded me. And actually, during the process of her interviewing me, I think I got more in touch with what it meant to be Jewish, which was basically in those days, oh, right, they're after the Black people, they're going to be after us too. I mean, we felt threatened as well. First of all, I think the numbers of Jewish people who participated is inflated, generally speaking. Because I remember being in Atlanta for a year or more, and I was the only Jewish person, man or woman. Or maybe there were 2, or maybe there were 3. Then the numbers that, and I'm proud to say that the numbers of Jews really swelled in 1964. And I know that at least 50% of the lawyers who went south were Jews. And many, probably the same of the medical people who went south. The actual number of Jews who participated in 1964, I don't know, and neither does anybody else, because in our application form, we never asked race or religion. So this is all anecdotal. I would say, though, just based on the people that I know, I would say maybe it was 25% of the people who went down. Of course, that is colossally out of proportion to our actual, existence in the country, because we are only 2% of the population. I'm proud of that, but I think in the Jewish community, I'm also critical of what some of the reactions have been, because I have given speeches and had people say to me, well, how come they're not grateful? Okay. I just have to stop and just have silence here because that, of course, pushed me over the edge when I heard that. I mean, if you're doing any of this for gratitude, get out and leave right now, I would say. You have to be in it because you believe in it, because you think it's the pathway to a civilized world. And we don't have time to go into whole blacks and Jews and all of that at this moment. But I feel in jeopardy. I know that the Jewish community is very wealthy and powerful in this country. I am in touch with my own feelings of jeopardy, and I think that is why I felt so affiliated with Black people. And the more I got involved in the Black community, the more I know that if people are looking around in this country for an example of courage, you don't have to look far. Look at the history of Black people, 400 years, and you will find the model. I feel that most of what I learned in my life was from Black people, and I'm deeply grateful. And I'm very lucky. Everybody said, oh, well, you didn't end up and you didn't make money and you blah, blah, blah. I consider myself fortunate that I was in the right place at the right time. I don't want to end on this note, though. I want to end, and if you'll allow me to say a few words about what I think we need to do now. As I said many times, I'm not a leader, I'm not a visionary, I'm not one of these really famous people, but I have been around the block. A lot of us have been around the block for a long time, and it's hard for me to even realize that I've been doing this for actually more than 60 years, since I was 13 years old, actually. What is happening now is we have a moment. We are now in the middle of this pandemic, which has illustrated that our system has failed. Capitalism has failed. It took a pandemic to do this. And now, when Bernie talks about healthcare being attached to one's job, now that is meaningful to people. Now they understand. No job, no healthcare. What I see going on is a tremendous amount of organizing, huge amount of organizing on the ground, which is wonderful. But I also see people being organizing in parallel, and they're organizing in the word that they use now, in silos. They're organizing about prison, they're organizing about environment, organizing about oppression of women, organizing LGBT. And I think what we need now to deal with our own situation, which we don't really have time to go into, is we need a massive united front. We need the top 50 organizations in this country to be locked in a room somewhere, socially distant and all of that, for a weekend and come out with the top 5 things that we think need to be done. And those 50 organizations would be able to win over in a few days thousands of organizations. There are thousands of local organizations. What has happened is people used withholding their labor as their only strength, because what do we really have? If you're not rich and powerful, you have your labor. And the virus took away our labor. So now the companies want everybody to rush back into this situation so that they can continue to make profit and to go on as they went before. We have to stop that. We can't go back to the way it was before. And just yesterday, I saw an email, I'll have to dig this up, of people who are working at these meat plants who are saying, no, we don't want to go back. We do not want to go back and die there, because they will die there. In a meat packing plant, I don't know if you can stand 6 feet apart, but that's the only way they're going to survive, is if they stand 6 feet apart. So I think we have a moment now where we say, no, we don't want to go back to the way things were before this pandemic started. And if we get thousands of organizations, I'm not talking about thousands of individuals, I'm talking about thousands of organizations, I have some hope that good will come out of this. So I don't want to distract this whole conversation into that, but I couldn't just say goodbye to everybody without saying, Judy has heard me say this before. I don't think she altogether agrees with me, but in any case, just to wind up, here we are, we're old people. What can we do for you? I'm talking to the young people. What can we do for you? Okay. We can give you a gift of ourselves. Okay, that's what I want to do. Is give you a gift of myself. It's not so much that I know better than you. It's just that I had experiences that you didn't have. And I don't know the age differential of the people who are listening now. But the reason why I love the young people is that they have the strength and they have the energy to keep on going. And that's what I'm really interested in, more than whether you're young or not. I actually am one of those people who do believe that things are someday going to be right. You can ask me why I believe such a foolish thing. Well, I can't help it. I do. And that's because I have seen what people manage to do. If you had said to me in 1960, do you think there will be a Voting Rights Act in 5 years from now? I would have said, no way, never. And what happened was we had Jim Foreman and Bob Moses and Ruby Doris Robinson and people who, I don't know if they thought it was going to be 5 years, but they knew that this was really, really, really important, what they were doing. And they convinced other people that it was really important. And I can't say that the South is so wonderful now as compared to what it was, but I think anybody who saw what went on there has to agree that what we managed to do, and I would say then SNCC takes great amount of credit for this, it wasn't the only civil rights organization, but I would think was in the forefront in the shock troop. They got rid of the terror. And I think the electoral strategy, you can quarrel with the presidential politics, and I've always been, leery of it. On a local level, if you can vote for the sheriff, then you're not going to get killed because you're riding in the car with a Black person. I mean, it's as simple as that. And for those of you who don't know her, I'm talking about Mrs. Liuzzo, who was killed for that very reason after the Selma March. And the only reason was that she was driving a car that had a Black man in it. And her window was open. You know how people used to drive in those days before air conditioning. I don't know if you even know that cars didn't have air conditioning. And you rode, and your elbow was, you were steering the car, and your elbow was like this on the roll down window, drove up a side on her side and shot her dead. So that doesn't happen anymore. And that's because people can vote for the sheriff. So is it all worth it? Yes, it's all worth it. And for those of you who are actually JVP members, who are young people, I would say that what you're doing is inestimably important. What you're doing now. and standing up for the rights of Palestinians to be treated like human beings is absolutely right. Absolutely. JVP has changed the conversation. It's never going back, never will go back to what it was, never. And that's because of JVP. And the more chapters you have, the more you grow, the stronger your voice is going to be. So and just finally to say that the reason I became a Jewish person involved in this is because of SNCC. And SNCC said to white people, you have to organize in your own community. I mean, it's fine that white people are going to go into the Black community, bullets are flying, you're going to be protected, you're going to be in a house where probably a Black person has a gun that they're ready to use to protect you. Okay, but you've got to go into your own community. And a lot of very brave white people tried that and failed. And I think finally I came to grips with this issue late in life. I was in my 60s before I really got involved in this. It was something that I was running away from for years. I knew it was so fractious and so contentious. And then I finally said, well, this is who I am, and I have to do something in my community. And so that's why for the past 17 years, I have been active in this, is to say to other Jews, no, you can't support this state. You can't. Even if it was founded because it wasn't founded for that reason, but even if considering the Holocaust, you cannot support policies that discriminate and kill other people who were living here when you got here. You can't do it, that's all. And it defies our social justice tradition, it defies our movement tradition. So it was SNCC that told me to do this. So there isn't anything that I wouldn't do for SNCC. So when it finally came home to me. So you could say that this circle has been closed. So
Dorothy, thank you so much. What an honor it was to hear all of your wisdom, and certainly an incredible gift that you shared with all of us, sharing all of those stories and making passionate calls for us to continue to organizing today with the most pressing issues that face us, and to stand to support the justice for Palestinians. Your book, Hands on the Freedom Plow, personal accounts by women in SNCC. I want you to know that in the chat, it was filled with lots of organizers who were saying that this book has shaped them as an organizer, that it's been assigned in colleges as reading. So your work and your commitment to bring in the women's voices in the organizing has not only now shared these for the sake of history, it's being shared in a way that's cultivating and shaping a new generation of organizers who are facing this world with all of your wisdom, emboldened by all of your courage. So my deepest gratitude and thank you for all that you've done.
Just
and
remember, there are six of us.
Yeah, exactly. And so that I would love to invite any of the other editors, any of your other co-editors on the call who would like to share any final words. We have Betty Robinson, I know, and Judy Richardson as well, if they would like to share something at this time.
Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted or what? Can I speak?
Yes, yeah. I hear you.
I really don't want to take away from Dorothy's amazing stories. I just want to say that one key thing I learned in SNCC was to tie my own freedom to that of the Black community in this country. And for many years, there was no movement in the sense of, there were lots of great organizations working in the trenches, but there was no movement until young Black people started taking up the issue of police brutality and community brutality. Trayvon Martin's case was one of the first. There were others, Jenna 6, et cetera, and then the police shooting. So to me, the young Black people are in the forefront again, and it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how do we both support them and how do we lead and work in our own communities, our white communities, to change them into supporting. And that one more thing I want to say is that in times of crisis, that's when you can move things forward in a really positive way. Let's not lose this opportunity to think about healthcare, to think about climate change, to think about police, to think about decarceration, all the issues that are bubbling up. So just again, I don't want to go on. Kudos to Dorothy. You told great stories, of course, and love you lots.
Okay, love you too, Betty.
Okay, I think I'm up. First of all, it's great to be here with Dottie and Betty. And by the way, I just got to say, Dottie is our hero. I mean, she really is. Dottie is our hero. Everybody who is SNCC on this call and people who aren't on this call, she's our hero. And it's not just because she walks 5 and 6 miles a day, you know, at the age of, 82 years old. I can barely make it down the block. You know, she is amazing, and she never stops. She never stops. And she brings all of these people in because she's just a nice person and she's funny as hell. So for me, when I stay with her at Christmas, you know, during the holidays and stuff, and it's like, I have such a good time. Now, I will say, when she talks about Miss Baker, that's the Miss Baker we knew. And one of the things Dottie talks about is, you know, the continuity of struggle. And one of the things that Miss Baker said was, and this is a direct quote, she said, "I believe that the struggle is eternal. Somebody else carries on." And so for a lot of us, we're not talking about, well, we're, you know, going to give, people are talking about, share the, whatever it is, you know, the baton. Okay, pass the baton. I ain't giving up the baton. My assumption, and Dottie's and Betty's and Tim Jenkins, who was on this call too, is we will keep running like Ms. Baker kept running until we can't do it anymore. And then whoever's on the other end of the baton, they keep carrying it, you know. But Dottie is, she's just a wonder. She's to all of us. So it's not just you guys on the call and the young people, it's all of us too.
Okay. That's nice. That's very nice. Thank you both. Thank you both. Love you both. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for both of you sharing your stories as well. What an honor it was to hear from all of you, and thank you for your courageous lives and your passionate calls to continue organizing. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Jewish Voice for Peace New York City. Our conversations with movement elders. By registering for this, we'll hopefully be in touch with you to be able to share about this weekly programming and our future guests. And we look forward to you tuning in, and we look forward to taking action together to continue to work for justice. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful afternoon and evening.
Okay.